To begin this discussion, if we are to talk about the classical period, which would be before the mid 6th century of the Islamic calendar or the 12th century of the Gregorian calendar, there was no attempt to analyze kalam, Islamic rational or speculative theology, as per the theory of science and Avicenna's logic, which would be the division of a science into constituent parts of principles, subject matter, and inquiries. We only find brief definitions and descriptions, and alongside that, legitimization of this science against those who deem it as a heretical innovation. This was based on the early controversy within Sunni Islam, especially between the traditionalists. Within early Sunni Islam, there was the very famous controversy between the traditionalists and the rationalists, mainly the Ahlul Hadith movement and the Mu'tazila, over the permissibility of rational theology. Mainly that the traditionalists said that this was a heretical innovation, whilst the Mu'tazila would have viewed it as not only permissible but necessary. Of course, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis later on synthesized both rational theology with Orthodox Sunni creed, but this was a later development. And of course, Atharis would say that they were heavily influenced by this rational theology and that led them to holding heretical beliefs, whilst the Mu'tazila might say that they were too traditionalist and they tried to compromise too much. Ash'aris and Maturidis would defend this by pointing out the rational basis for creed and that God has ordered us to truly know that there is no God but Him, and He has ordered to certainty in belief regarding sort of the tenets of Islamic faith, and that can only be achieved by both the rational means and the scriptural means. Nevertheless, we find the likes of al-Baqilani, who is one of the most famous early theologians of the Ash'ari school, who passed away in the year 403 Hijri of the Islamic calendar, or 1013 of the Gregorian calendar. He quotes in his book At-Tamheed, he mentions in this book, regarding the science of theology, of kalam, he mentions in relation to its definition and description things such as epistemology, ontology, revealed doctrines, meaning doctrines that are established by religious texts and etc. But he doesn't mention, he doesn't try to analyze the science of rational theology as per the theory of science and Avicenna's logic. He only gives these details about what the discussions in this science include. Some later theologians, such as Al-Iji, deduced that the proper subject of kalam, of rational theology, is the known. It is what is al-ma'lum. Abd al-Qahir al-Baghdadi, who passed away in the year 429 of the Islamic calendar, or 1030 of the Gregorian calendar, in Iyar al-Nazar, he mentions 5 divisions of knowledge of what's obligatory to believe in with certainty. The first is the origination of the world. The second is knowledge about the Creator. The third is knowledge about His justice. The fourth is knowledge of His prophets via miracles. And the fifth is what is possibly and not possibly found in Revelation. In brief, it's a discussion of axiology, and reason determines the scope for the limits of what revelation can prescribe. Abul Qasim al-Iskaf, who passes away in the year 452 of the Islamic calendar, or 1060 of the Gregorian calendar, in Kafiya fil Jadal mentions, the reality of the science of the foundations of religion is the knowledge of what entails knowledge of God the Exalted, His attributes, and the attributes of His prophets, and the norms of His religion. Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, who is an incredibly famous and important figure in the Ash'ari school, who passed away in the year 478 of the Islamic calendar, or 1085 of the Gregorian calendar, mentions in the mysterious Al-Burhan fi Usul al-Fiqh. The view that he mentions is similar to Baghdadi's, but it is slightly more refined and developed. As a side note here, the reason why I say that this is a mysterious book is that the book has been labelled the riddle of the community by Tajuddin as-Subki, who passed away in the year 771 Hijri of the Islamic calendar, or 1370 of the Gregorian calendar. He says so in his Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya, the biographical accounts of the Shafi'is, Al-Kubra, the major sort of compendium of the biographies of the Shafi'i scholars. It's because in this book, Al-Juwayni charts his own very critical path. He adopts positions rejected by most of the Ash'ari school, and even by Juwayni himself in other works. Subki is open to an earlier scholar's suggestion that some forgeries may exist in the text. Other points that are discussed are research into epistemology as the main source for kalam, rational theology. And the point of kalam and the point in kalam is to achieve knowledge. Then Ghazali comes along in his Mustasfa fi Usul al-Fiqh, and he gives a slightly expanded version of the Baghdadi Juwayni analysis. He divides all sciences into the profane and sacred, and then divides them further into universal and particular sciences. Kalam, rational Islamic theology or speculative theology, is a universal sacred science, and the mutakallim, the theologian, inquires into the most general of things, which is the existent. The existent is the eternal and originated, can be divided into the eternal and originated, and the originated can be divided into substance and accident. The accident can be further divided into its respective divisions. Most later authors said that Ghazali held the subject matter of kalam in the technical sense that it was the existent. Abul Qasim al-Ansari, who passed away in the year 512 of the Islamic calendar and 1118 of the Gregorian calendar, in his Al-Ghunya fil Kalam, mentions, but when knowledge obtains, all deficiencies vanish. This shows the emphasis on knowledge and certainty within the Kalam tradition before sort of in this classical era. But furthermore, it shows this focus on sort of epistemology and ontology, etc. But there's still no attempt so far to define Kalam in terms of the theory of science proposed by Avicenna's logic. Interestingly enough, he also mentions that meanwhile the prohibition regarding the learning of sorcery is related to its abuse and not its theoretical acquisition, for one may need to know sorcery to distinguish between it and an authentic miracle. This is an interesting passage because what it's saying is that the science in and of itself of sorcery, which is deemed as an evil sin by Muslims, but the science of it in and of itself is not impermissible. Rather, its impermissible application is what is prohibited. But learning the science in and of itself is permissible. There are a few benefits that can be derived from this. First of all, is that traditionalist scholars from the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools would argue the same for Kalam, mainly that Kalam, if it is used to defend what they would say is heterodox beliefs, then it is impermissible, but if it is used to defend orthodox beliefs, according to what they would view as orthodox beliefs at least, then it is permissible. He then goes on to say that whichever science has a more noble object, then that science itself is more virtuous, and that since there is no object of knowledge greater than God, the Exalted, then there is no knowledge. Thus, the view that the subject matter of kalam, of theology, according to earlier theologians, was the known, the al-ma'lum, it may be misconceived as a post facto projection onto the earlier tradition. But the reality is that this was a view held by North African Ash'ari mutakallim, theologian al-Mawsili, and cited by al-Yafrini in his al-Mabhath al-Aqliya, that the subject matter of ilm al-kalam is strictly the known. He is the first Ash'ari mutakallim to make explicit identification of subject matter as the known, as the Yusuf al-Ma'lum. And this was 150 years before Al-Amuli, who passed away in the year 750 Hijri or 1352 of the Gregorian calendar. Apart from Al-Mawsili, none of the other previous authors attempt to explicitly identify the subject matter of kalam in the technical sense. This lack of interest persists with Razi and Ahmadi, even though they were acquainted with works on logic by Avicenna, and they made their own significant interventions in those works.